Meltface Productions. This is Listening Glass.
Robin.
Wow, man. Strong start. That's you have correctly identified your co-host so far.
Yes. I was waiting for like an affirmative of some kind.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yo, Arjuna.
Yo.
What's up, Arjuna?
Hey. How's it going?
It's good.
All right, cool.
Let's go.
In the same room recording a podcast. All right, so Robin, what percentage of the software that you use on a daily basis
Oh, God.
have you paid for?
Ooh, have I paid for?
Mm-hmm.
It's actually hard to think of one that I've paid for.
Okay, that's telling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, have you...
I'm racking my brain right now trying to think of anything I use that is something I've paid for. Because pretty much everything I use, there's like a free version of.
Mm-hmm.
And the stuff I would have had to have paid for were paid for by like previous employers and things like that.
Okay.
You know, like a fancy IDE for doing code, like a code editor and things like that were paid for by companies or they had licenses or something. So, I mean...
How about like phone apps that cost you like $1 or something?
There's a handful.
Mm-hmm.
Like I subscribed to Medium recently, but it's like not
negligible.
It's probably $5 worth per month of apps that I buy.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Okay, how about this? You play video games, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And those cost you money?
Those do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So most of those aren't free.
No.
So just
that's
like
yeah.
After like a quick assessment, what would you say? Like 10%, 15%?
It's almost like I need percentage of time that is paid.
Fair.
And it's split between like programming and watching like entertainment stuff and gaming. I'd say maybe like a fifth of my time involves apps that I pay money for.
Mm-hmm.
Or software that I pay money for. And for that stuff is pretty cheap too.
Right.
Yeah.
So so for me, I'm trying to think, it's like I use an email client that I did pay for.
Really?
Yeah. Cause I have so many email addresses and I needed an old school, like centralized email client that I could get them all delivered to.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You couldn't just have like all of them forwarded to like a certain Gmail address or something?
That would have been a nightmare.
Okay.
Gmail's good, but like it's not that good. You know what I mean?
I professionally haven't had to use my email hardly at all for like 5 years.
Yeah.
I count myself very lucky in that respect.
I would say between my personal email address, my various work emails, and my various emails for projects like this, I probably have about 20 email addresses.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I've had to do a little streamlining over time, right?
Wow.
I have probably spent money on somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of the software I currently use. And that's just kind of interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, now there's some software, for example, like the software that came with your computer, you did pay for that in a way, probably. Like, the manufacturer who made your computer paid Windows for their software for a license. Or, Apple Computer rolls in a certain amount of the price of your device to cover their software costs.
For the OS, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
I wonder, because it's kind of gray with Windows now. I don't think, is Windows 10 still $100? I think you have to pay $100 to get just like the basic version.
Yeah, you can't just like download Windows 10
free. The thing is, you can download it for free, but there's certain features that are unavailable until you pay for it. And
it's illegal.
It's not illegal. No,
really?
No. I don't think so. I think because they just disable certain features until you have an actual license. And the features that they disable is like the ability to change the desktop background desktop background in your theme, which is really trivial.
I think that they do that to effectively limit it, but I think it is actually not legal in the long run to use a version of Windows that you or your computer
per the terms of service.
Didn't pay for. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. But things could have changed. But what I'm getting at here is that we live in this modern digital era, and every piece of digital hardware that we use requires software to run. And you are a professional software developer for a living.
Yeah.
And can you just share with the class how much work does it take to make functioning software?
Way too much.
Like, we're talking like thousands of human hours to produce like even simple software, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a cliche in the industry that anytime that you start a project or you're starting on a feature, the amount of time you think it's going to take, you just take that and double it. And I usually take it and do a factor of 2.5, and that's pretty close to how much time it actually takes to do it. And that's for people who are used to guessing how long this stuff takes. But it's a lot of effort for sure. Yep.
Totally.
Typically, especially if you're writing something from scratch, which, we rarely are software developers writing everything involved in their project from scratch. Thanks mostly to open source software. And that coders make their code available to other developers to save them time.
Right. So even paid software is often developed like off of the bootstrapping of free software.
Yeah. When I first started with web development, I didn't know what I was doing. And so what I would do is I would just start writing HTML and start writing some JavaScript and start writing some CSS and just started doing everything from scratch. And now what I'll do is I'll use a command line tool that'll basically bootstrap a project for me and create kind of this like file architecture and import a whole bunch of different modules and libraries that I can use for my project, say for a web development project, if I want to make a web app. And the cumulative like storage involved and all of that stuff, I can just run a single line command to bootstrap the project and get this stuff. And once I've installed it all, it's like 0.5 gigabyte of worth of programs.
And that would have taken you like...
I would in my whole life, would never write all of that.
By yourself?
No.
Yeah. So it's just... I think that this is fascinating, and I think that so much of this is happening under the radar of everyday life, and I think that so many users are using free software every day without realizing it. And I just think that that's really interesting. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to go into just a brief history of software and the free software movement. And we're going to discuss the implications of it.
I'm curious if we'll talk beyond the envelope of software and just about open source technology in general, right? Because it goes much... I was thinking initially just about software as well, but it's much broader than that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. So we can definitely talk about that. So there's a lot to cover here. We're not going to go super deep on the technicalities of it.
Probably better.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So, and as much to preserve your wakefulness as a listener as anything else, because it gets pretty technical and not everyone wants to get into the details. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, what does the word free actually mean? Right?
Yeah.
Because the amount that you paid for a software is only part of how free it was. So there's this saying in the software world, people make this distinction, free as in beer and free as in speech.
Right.
So Robin, what does free as in beer mean?
Free means you didn't pay for it.
You didn't pay for it.
Yeah.
You didn't shell out your money to purchase the software. So how about free as in speech? What does that mean?
No restrictions on what you can do with it, right? So it's about your ability to use that tool or method in whatever way you see fit, basically.
what we're talking about here with free as in speech, we're essentially talking about intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what happens is just like so many other things that people make from their effort and from their ideas and that involves some kind of creativity, software is it's a product. It's an intellectual product and an intellectual property. And so when you sit down and you write some code, that belongs to you. And actually, this is an interesting little legal tidbit, is that copyright law around the world generally holds that if you were to just sit down and write some software in an afternoon, that's automatically copyrighted to you.
Really?
Yes. And if anyone were to take that software and modify it and do some other stuff with it, you, in most places in the world, would have the authority to take them to court.
Wow.
And you'd have a pretty strong case against them.
Huh.
So it's a little bit like...
But what if they like took the code from me or found like... But if I put my code on the internet without any sort of license and somebody used it...
Is a bad idea.
Yeah.
For them to use it.
Okay.
Because... So yeah, this is interesting. We'll talk about licenses in a little while.
Yeah.
But yes, copyright law would protect your right to take those people to court.
Okay.
And here's an interesting thing. If you put your software up on the internet and you said, this is free, do whatever you want with it, have your way with this software, have fun. If that was the note, buy it, you would still legally be able to take those people to court if they did anything with your software.
I actually like that. I prefer that the default is to protect creators and to give them proprietorship or ownership of what they've created and the ability to decide who can do what with it by default. And if they want to say legally that this is in fact open to you and you can do whatever you want with it, that it's not terribly difficult to do so, right?
Yeah.
And they can do that, right? But because I do think it's always a sad story when someone creates something and then it gets kind of snuck out, like snatched out from under them.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of a tale, seems like a common tale in the history of creative people and whatnot. And I don't know how true that is, but I
agree. Well, and it gets really into the fundamentals of whatever your society's philosophies and ideas are around ownership, right? So there are bleeding heart people in the open source and free software communities, and not just in those communities either, but there are people in the general creative communities who feel that everything should be free, right? Whether it's a song that you wrote, a book that you wrote, maybe a piece of art that you made.
Yeah.
People have this idea that this just, art and creation belongs to everyone and should be available to everyone to use, modify, etc. as you choose. Now, I'm not saying that I particularly defend this notion, but that is it's a line of thinking out there.
Right.
Something to the effect of nobody should be able to own an idea. Nobody should be able to own a creative property. What do you think about that?
Well, like music. Is music an idea? If I go out and write a song and compose it with 3 other people, is that an idea that is, you could think of it at its core as a kind of like mental phenomenon, or it can be abstracted away as a mental phenomenon, but it's still something that some group of people created that no one else did and nobody else would have, right? Typically. I mean, there's some pop songs out there that I don't know. Maybe multiple people actually did create at the same time, given how formulaic they are. But probably not, even with that, like very formulaic stuff. Like this stuff isn't repeated. And I guess I do have a sort of individualistic mentality about that, where credit is due, to the person who did actually create it.
Right.
And not just someone who found it and appreciated it. right? Yeah.
I think it's just good to acknowledge coming into it that you have that viewpoint. And one of the things that I'm hoping that people will get out of listening to this show is to really examine their own ideas about ownership.
Yeah.
And what should be considered a private thing that you own versus what shouldn't.
Right. No, I think there still is a lot of virtue in being generous with things that we create and allowing people to have access to them and to have rights to modify them. But I think that should ultimately be up to the creator.
Right.
Yeah.
So it should, the choice should start with the person who made it. I think in the context of the paradigm that we live in the context of this modern notion of ownership as it is generally practiced in the world, I would agree with you. I think that that's a very reasonable place to start. I think it's reasonable to say, so-and-so wrote this book and someone else shouldn't be able to just plagiarize it and make money off of it.
Well, because here's what's going to happen is, let's say you wrote a book and it's a good book and you publish it through some shoelace, publisher that's regional, and they just don't have a lot of clout and ability to kind of like promote it. And then somebody with a lot more resources than you finds it and says, oh, wait, this could actually be a big thing. And they throw a little bit of capital at it and a little bit of money, and they have a little more clout and all of this. And suddenly it's a big hit, but under their name and with their publisher. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that happens, right?
Right.
So I think that I see this as actual protections for people who wouldn't have resources to kind of fight that and to start something and actually keep their name tied to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that acknowledges the reality that we live in a system which has inequality, economic inequality at its base. So I think it would be less of an issue if everyone was taken care of about the same amount. Right. Then the question of who is profiting off of something would be a lot less relevant. And which isn't to say, and again, it's like, it's interesting because we're talking about the difference between beer and speech, right? So even if someone did live in some kind of a monetarily equitable culture where everyone was given the same amount of basic resources, people might take issue with someone saying, oh, I came up with that idea, right? Or like, I made that song. Someone else might say hey, it was my brainchild. Yeah. And I want to get credit for having been the person who actually created this, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about the money.
There's been times where I can't even remember a specific example, but I say I had an idea, and then a friend of mine later was like, oh yeah, I had this idea that I'm going to do this thing. And then like, they're saying this to like a group of friends that we're with. And I clearly remember that, like, pitching the idea to them. and I just remember being really kind of like bothered by it.
You bastard.
Like, and this wasn't something we were going to make money off of or anything. It was just like a project we were going to work on.
Yeah.
And so what I'm getting at is that money is one thing, but also identity and status is another thing that are also important. And I'm not a selfless Buddha creature that doesn't care at all about, being recognized in the world, So yeah, I think I realize how kind of like, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but like deep individualism is kind of just like a virtue in myself, right? That I more or less own.
Yeah. And I think that that's fairly common. I think most people have some amount of it, right? And I do think that the people who advocate for the most freedom in regards to speech and beer tend to be like extremists.
Right. Well, and here's a perspective where I could understand it, is that if you're thinking about, well, like I tried to make a video montage a couple years back when we were doing the PUBG podcast.
Yeah.
and I put some like Beastie Boys or something along to it, and I threw it up on YouTube, and YouTube immediately said, you can't put this up here because it has copyrighted material.
Yeah.
And I was kind of pissed off.
Right.
I was like, but like, this is like, everyone knows this Beastie Boys song. Everyone knows it's the Beastie Boys. Nobody's going to think I created this.
Yeah.
But the video content I did create, and I just wanted to be able to share it in this way that would have like good musical backdrop, right? And so I don't know if I'm going to say that I should have been able to do that, because I don't really know exactly where I stand on that. I think I should have been able to just post it and credit the Beastie Boys at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think where people are coming from is that they see a lot of really valuable resources that are tied up in proprietary companies, right? Or companies that claim copyright on them, and that could actually benefit society greatly if they were made available. And so like music, who knows? I'm not really going to make a case that
I'm going to debate
having
the value of music.
Access to the Beastie Boys is going to like make me a great video maker and change the world or whatever. But there's cases to be made. I think a really interesting case is medical technology.
I was just going to say, like the conversation becomes different when we're talking about things that people generally consider as necessities.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, exactly. Medicine. Or even just something simple like maybe how to dig a well, right? It's like if someone comes up with a really good way to create something that people generally need.
Right.
And then they hoard it and try to profit off of it.
Right.
Something like that.
Well, so like the capitalist argument is that we should do that because we then incentivize innovation.
Sure.
Right? Like no one's going to spend years researching how to make the best well if they're not going to get any profit off of it, right? So the thinking goes. Some people will, maybe, but a lot of people won't, right? And I think there is an argument for that that I can kind of understand. But when it comes to medical technology, especially given the medical industry in our country and how much profiteering there is.
Oh, I mean, it's insane.
Looking at the way prices are rigged, really.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. And if people did have more access, especially to biotech stuff, what one case I looked into was this kind of automated pancreas device for people with type 1 diabetes.
Okay.
Which is really cool. So the basic idea, and it's this open source project where I just read a bit about it, and the basic idea is that you have a glucose monitor that's attached to your body. So I was kind of checking in maybe every 5 minutes or so on the glucose levels in your blood. And the other component is an insulin injector. And so you have this little module that's sensing, has sensors and determines what your glucose level is. And if you need insulin, it'll inject insulin in you automatically.
Okay.
Right. And the people who created this were basically saying, look, the FDA regulations on and all the companies who are creating it are trying to do stuff like this are taking way too long. And the devices that are out there now aren't very good. And we could probably just do it ourselves. So they did it themselves and they made the whole thing open source. And my understanding is that you can basically go look at their device plans. And I don't know what the exact steps are. If it's just like, here's how to make the thing, if they give you kind of a recipe to make it on your own, or if they tell you what to buy and how to piece things together. But that it's considered an open source project and that people can modify, and they describe in plain English, which isn't common in the coding world, how the what the logic is behind the program in terms of sensing and when to dose insulin and things like that.
Sure. So it's like a human readable layer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which I think ethically makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
I applaud them for doing that. I don't know if they're just taking their own personal time to make that happen, but a lot of people certainly are, right? I doubt very many people involved with that project are getting paid, but maybe they started a foundation or something to kind of like boost it along. Who knows?
Yeah, sure.
But
so before we get too much further, why don't you help us to understand? You've been using this term open source. So for those who are not familiar with this term, what does it mean?
Okay. So the way I think of open source is that whoever develops a piece of, let's just say software, to make it simple. There's other things that could be open source. Attaches a license to that software that says that here's all of the source code that makes this thing work, right? And not only can you read that source code, but you can also change it because maybe it's almost what you need as a tool for your own project, but you need to modify it a little bit. So go ahead, modify it. You can then, after you modify it, redistribute it to other people. And I think the really cool thing about it is that the license dictates that once you redistribute it, anyone else who uses it or modifies it for their own purposes has to redistribute it under that same license.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's the kind of magic part.
So it's enforced generosity, right? It's like if you're going to use this, then you have to let others use the changes that you make to it. Now,
that doesn't mean you can't charge for people using it, which I think is kind of cool. So you and I could go out and we could take hundreds of open source projects and put them together in some really cool new social media app or whatever.
Right.
Which isn't going to happen, but whatever tool you want to think of, right?
Yeah.
And we can charge people money to use it, right? Even though we're using code that a bunch of other people wrote and gave to us freely, we can charge money for it. But so could anyone else, right? They could create, if we could do it, so could other people, right?
Right. So something you're highlighting here is the distinction between source code and effective code, right? So let's just unpack that a little bit, because I think some people aren't familiar with how software is developed most of the time, right? So the program that runs on your computer or on your phone or whatever is very, very different than the code that was written to create it.
Correct.
So I think a lot of people think that a computer program is like, it's this book of information. It's just, thousands of lines of characters that create the code. And then I think a lot of people think that you just plug that into whatever operating system you're using, and it just reads through those lines of code dynamically when you're using the software. And that's actually not what happens a vast majority of the time.
Well, it never happens because computers don't read human language at all.
Right. So it always has to be interpreted by something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what's cool. It's kind of hard as a programmer. I try to think about it as little as I can because
okay. Fair.
Because when we write programs, we're writing statements like if blah blah blah, then do blah blah blah, and just as kind of like very human readable stuff.
Right.
And the computer doesn't actually, when I say the computer, what I mean is the processor, right? And the hardware. And the hardware is just a bunch of machinery that runs on electricity, and it has a bunch of basically gates and switches that are open or closed. And that stuff all relies on just voltage running through it. And that stuff's all 1 and 0. So when I say open source, what I mean is that it's the source code. So I'm going to write human legible source code, say in JavaScript.
Right.
And then it's actually an interpreted language, but at the end of the day, that language is broken down by the computer into 1s and 0s that the machinery can execute.
Right.
It's instruction set that the machine can execute. And
there's an intermediate step there, which is compiling, right? So I think that's something that makes the distinction between free and open source matter, I think. Because, okay, so what happens is you'll write some code, and then you will compile that code. And what a compiler does is it takes that human readable code and it translates it into what they call binaries. And that's basically a lot closer to the ones and zeros that the processor is going to be running, right? And so what you have is the code that was written by Robin, for example, is perhaps you could think of it as the blueprint. And maybe it's like, imagine you're making a car, right? So the source code would be the blueprint for the car. And then the compiler is like the factory that makes the car, right? It takes that blueprint and it translates the blueprint via these mechanisms into molding the material, which ends up being your car, right? So then the software is the car. And so if you are free to use your car however you want to, that's one kind
You're
of
saying
freedom.
the software is the car.
Yes.
See, I would say the car is the program running.
Sure, that could be.
Right, in a way, because the source code to me is all of the knowledge and expertise and mechanization that goes into the manufacture of that car.
Sure.
Right? And the actual car is more like, if I played a video game, it's watching the video game unfold. But that doesn't mean I know the code, right?
Well, that's just the distinction I want to make, is that if you take a piece of software, just, like let's say you download Firefox, right? You cannot take that binary that you downloaded and look at the source code.
No.
And so that's what makes some of these distinctions matter, right? Is that some licenses say you can do whatever you want with that Firefox binary that you downloaded.
Okay.
But you do not have access to the source code.
Right.
And so that's very different, because in one thing, it's a bit more about use, how you use it, right? And in another, it's like actually having access to the DNA and being able to make fundamental changes.
I was trying to think of other examples of things that are just kind of innately open source, right? Like, let's say I wanted to remix a Radiohead song.
Sure.
Like, I don't have the master tracks for the Radiohead song.
Exactly.
Which would basically be the source code, right?
The original recordings.
Yep.
Yep.
And I don't have like the mix of that, and I don't have the different tracks that I could play with. So in order for me to do anything with the Radiohead song, I basically have to reverse engineer the whole thing. Right.
Or just pull out chunks of the finished product and try to make those work.
Right.
Which is a lot harder.
Way harder, because that's all muddled together as one sound wave.
You can't just pull a voice out.
No.
Or at least it's very hard and you lose a lot when you try to do that.
So, but one thing I think someone else brought this up to me was plays. So it's plays, if you do
sure.
keep wanting to say screenplay. Well, this is a script for a play.
It's like a stage play.
Yeah. That basically it's just lines and a little bit of words describing the scene and scene changes and things like that. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Right. Yeah. And then everyone has their own liberty about how they implement, the props and do transitions.
I
and
see
stuff
what
like
you mean.
That.
So by nature, a stage play is open source.
Yeah. Because even from the very beginning, people were always interpreting what that play, how it was supposed to be executed, right?
Now, that's interesting, though, because your average play, you can't then take it as it is written and modify it and then call it your own and profit from it, right?
No, probably not. However, the source is there.
Yeah.
But like legally, you're right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But most things we don't even have the source to.
That's
like
a good point.
If I wanted to make my own version of the movie Avatar, that movie's like all CG and is mostly code at the end of the day, probably, or it ends up being. And yet, there's no way, I would be able to recreate that based on the finished product, right? So I just thought that was interesting. Yeah, there's not a lot of things that are just out there for you to take and modify to be your own.
Correct. So I think that this part of what makes this conversation so interesting is that different projects allow people different levels of access and different amounts of rights for what they can do with the things that they do have access to. And and I'm just gonna, because we're talking about licenses, I'm gonna cover this briefly. There are many different licenses that you can apply to intellectual property in general. And even the world of software has, hundreds, if not thousands, if not more than thousands of different licenses. Right. And so when you hear people talking about free software, they'll often refer to this kind of laundry list of the most common licenses that you'll see. Those include the Apache license. There is the GPL, which is a big one. You have the BSD license, which we're going to talk about in a little while here. You have the CPL, the Common Public License. You have the MIT license, of course, developed by the university. And so what you're able to do with any given, whether it's a piece of software or a creative product or whatever, is very, very specifically spelled out in the license. And you'll see this, whether it's software, or a lot of people release other things, like they'll release creative works under a certain license. And so you can, for example, there are plenty of people who have written a play that they release under a certain kind of a license, which does let somebody else take that and rewrite the play if they wanted to, and maybe sell tickets to see that play and not have to pay royalties or not have to give a damn about it, right? So there's a lot of nuance to this, and chances are, if you have an idea about how you want to share something and the levels of access that you want to give people and the stipulations on where someone can and can't make money from it, chances are that there is an existing license which has been thoroughly vetted in court.
It's really interesting to think about. I'm thinking, I mentioned Radiohead earlier, and they had an album about over a decade ago now called In Rainbows. Do you remember that?
Yeah, which was like semi-free as in beer, right?
Yes, exactly. Free as in beer, right? So it's called, quote unquote, the free album, right? And they just released it on their website, and you could just pay what you wanted, and you could pay $0 if you wanted, and then you could download the album. And I'm a big fan, so I paid whatever I thought an album price was, like $12 or $15 or something like that. But what would be really interesting is if a band released master tracks, right? Or is that what you would call it? Is this, you're more of the sound engineer?
It would be it would probably be like the mix tracks. Masters generally tend to refer to the track that's already been combined. But it's like the mix tracks. The source tracks.
I want the vocal track. I want the drums. I want, and there's probably 20 of them per song, if not more. Of different track layers that I could go in and edit and change and make my own remix. And that's what remix artists do typically, right? Is they'll request from the artist. They'll say, "Hey, I want to remix your song. I'm a great remix artist," and then the artist will grant them access, to a particular track, and then they'll make a remix. And I just think that'd be really. I wonder if there's a lot of songs out there that are actually available that are popular.
No, people have done it, and it's interesting you mentioned the Beastie Boys because they did a thing. I don't remember what track it was, but they took a very well-known Beastie Boys track.
Really?
And they released the individual tracks, and it was some kind of publicity stunt. They wanted people to remix it, and they had a contest, right?
Yeah.
But it was a cool thing that they did, and it was an example of.
I think it's a good idea.
I think it is. Well, and okay, so here's the interesting thing. Hip hop is especially interesting because the majority of hip hop is created from other people's sampled works.
Right.
And so I think that there's a fundamental irony to your not being able to use a Beastie Boys track on your video given the fact that most Beastie Boys tracks themselves are comprised of multiple other people's musical tracks, right? So
here's a question.
Very interesting.
Let's say one of the items that they sampled was under a certain very open permissive license.
Sure.
I guess my question
is like, use that part of it? Is that your question?
If they use that part of it, does that then require the Beastie Boys make their own track that they use it in accessible?
Yeah. That that's interesting. You could like stealth open source someone's music by slipping your license in there. That's hilarious.
Here, have a free sample. GPL.
Yeah, exactly. So
no, I wonder about that. I mean, because there's a lot of software projects that will have GPL components or general public license components, which means that, but that's not the product itself, right? Yeah. So they're using an open source tool to make a software product, but that doesn't in turn make the whole software product open source. It doesn't inherit that license. Only if they just kind of modify that little module and redistribute that module does it have to be open source.
Exactly. So
weird.
It all gets very technical, and like so many things with law, the devils are really in the details, right? Mm-hmm. But I just think I like the idea that laws have been tailored around all of these different particular use cases that you might have and you might want. And I like the idea that it's like there's a framework already created to support people who want to do this, right? And things that protect them. So, like, for example, an example of a legal protection you might want to have in a license that is free is I've released this version of this software. If someone takes it and modifies it in a nefarious way, right? If someone takes my software and uses it for terrorism, I don't want for that to come back to me.
Okay.
Right? So that might be an example of like, you're like, you can do whatever you want with this.
Yeah.
But I'm not taking legal responsibility for what you do with it.
Right.
And if you didn't have that specified in your license, you could end up in some hot water.
Well, what's interesting about open source, at least the kind of ethos of it, and there was a kind of 9-point definition I remember seeing in, what was it called? OS Revolution, the documentary on Linux. Yeah. And also on the Free Software Foundation, Free Software Movement.
Right.
Where I remember one of the points was basically anyone who used the software and redistributed it couldn't discriminate against who used it.
Interesting.
And they couldn't discriminate against the types of purposes it was used for. Right. And so the example that they used was if you modified some, say, client management software, you couldn't then say that anyone that uses it couldn't use it at an abortion clinic. And you also could not say that anti-abortion people couldn't use it either. Basically, anyone, terrorist included, for whatever purpose they would use that for, could use it.
Yeah. So it gets interesting and it gets complicated. And actually, so I'm glad that you brought this up because I did want to cover just a little bit of the history of software and the free software movement because I think it's quite interesting.
Okay.
So we're going to try to keep this brief, but basically, computers have been around for a while. Some point to like World War II era as kind of the beginning of things that looked like the modern computers that we know of now. And ever since people have been making computers, they've needed software to actually run those computers in some form or another. So, and I'm not going to go into the whole history of coding, but basically around 1969, 1970, the AT&T Bell Labs, which was one company at the time, they were developing an operating system that came to be called Unix. And just for the real, not technical amongst us, an operating system is a fundamental layer of software that you put on a computing device, whether it's your desktop PC or your laptop or your smartphone or all kinds of other things. And it's like the base code. So the operating system is when you turn the thing on, the software which is running when it turns on is the operating system. And all of the other software that you run on that device has to sit on top of and plug into and work with the operating system that's there.
Including you.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, meaning the user has to interact with the operating system in order to interact with programs, is my understanding. It's kind of a middleman between you and any application that you would use.
Exactly. And something that is not necessarily apparent to the user is that the operating system provides a lot of the raw materials that the software gives you. So, for example, when a software is running on your computer, it does have a certain amount of its visual look, which it has provided itself, but a lot of it comes directly from the operating system. And the operating system generates a lot of these kind of low-level utilities, which allow this higher-level, more sophisticated software to run properly. So Unix was an operating system, and one of the fascinating things about Unix was that a few years into its development, they rewrote it in the C programming language. Now, this wasn't a common thing that happened at the time. A lot of people at that time and beforehand were writing operating systems that interfaced directly with the hardware that they were going to be on. So in other words, they would conceive of a computer, whatever it was, some model of computer, and they would write an operating system directly for that machine. And so what was happening was that operating system was it was written in a language which translated from human language into machine level instructions that powered the thing. So the interesting thing about writing an operating system in a programming language was that it was not a machine language. It was not designed for any one particular machine. It was designed to, in theory, you could run this software on any device. Right. And so that was a really interesting thing that they did.
Because usually hardware, when you're writing a program back then, you would write it for a certain processor, a certain set of RAM, a certain type of memory, a certain type of storage, and it would have to interface with all those and keep their specifics in mind of that particular hardware implementation. But yeah, so like Windows can run on any type of laptop, whether it has an AMD processor, an Intel processor, and any of those models, right?
Yeah.
More or less, right? Like it's not going to run on
most
anything.
Popular ones.
But yeah, the ones that are manufactured, in order to kind of fit that use case. But yeah.
Exactly. And so it was kind of a novel idea at the time to write, to have an idea that an operating system could be ported to all kinds of different devices. And I think that that's one of the reasons that Unix became, in some ways, kind of like the grandparent of a lot of modern operating systems today.
Yeah.
So they're working on Unix, and they quickly realized, like, man, this Unix thing's really cool. So by the end of the decade, there was another main variant. This is kind of like the AT&T/Bell Labs Unix, right?
Right.
And then midway through the 80s, midway through the 70s, the Berkeley, the school in California, started working on their own variant.
Right.
And so they forked it, essentially, which is in software, that means when you take a software that's in development and you copy the code in part or in whole, and then you just start working on it
Yeah, adding the things you want to it and modifying it to
And it's basically like a family tree. It's like you literally took you cut a branch off of a tree and you planted that and you started a whole new tree. So oftentimes when you fork a project as like a completely different team, sometimes they end up sharing between them, and that's actually what happened with AT&T version versus what they called the Berkeley software distribution, which was the Berkeley Unix, was that they were kind of separated, but then over time they incorporated a lot of similar features because both of their user bases wanted those features. So those were the main two variants of Unix for a long time, but as time went on, there were just more and more. So in the 80s, there were all kinds of Unices running around. IBM was developing one. Sun Microsystems had a popular version of Unix. And there was just kind of like this proliferation happening. And the interesting thing was that as time went on, more and more corporate interests and just large institutional interests came along and realized, boy, there's big money in operating systems. Everyone needs one. And we don't particularly want for our stuff to get taken and used by somebody else. And so, and maybe you can shed a little bit of light on this, Robin, but the impression I get is that the further back you go in the world of software, the less kind of jealous and covetous people tended to be about their software.
You know, I just went to this tech meetup last night, and I was asking some of the older tech veterans kind of like, you know, what do you think of open source? And, you know, should people who aren't programmers care and stuff like that? But one of the things they said, and one of the guys said, I should say, is that basically open source was kind of the original way of thinking about software.
Okay. Yeah.
I think the basic, he mentioned the basic programming language as being an example. And that basic was basically, it was there for everybody, no pun intended. And
so the people who developed that just weren't even thinking about monetizing.
Based on what he said, I haven't verified that.
Right.
And so people could take it and make their own variants. And he said that actually Bill Gates and one of his partners at the time actually took it and made their own flavor of it and then made it proprietary and closed it. Right. And then would like pursue legal action if other people used it in an open source way.
I have heard that Bill Gates was like a notable early proponent of privatizing software.
So this is like the big fight back then was basically it was him trying to kind of dominate and be a profiteer off of software and make it closed source. And then there's Richard Stallman, who's trying to make everything open. And those are the two kind of like figureheads I think of in terms of like representing the different sides of the battle.
It's like the Godzilla and Mothra of the great software divide, right?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned Richard Stallman. Let's talk about him briefly. Stallman was working... So he was basically working at several different institutions, and he was just like a young and quite brilliant software developer who was really at the forefront of a lot of these developments. And he developed a particular distaste for what he saw as this kind of increasing march of proprietary philosophy in software. And as people started to do even simple things, like, for example, in one of the institutions he worked in, when he started there, the computers they were unsecured, right? So you could just walk up to a terminal and the command line was just right there. And you had basically administrator access.
Right. There's no username or password.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's like any user who was standing at that particular terminal was like had godlike power over what happened on that
They could
system.
just delete everything on the disk if they wanted to.
Totally. They could do whatever they wanted, right?
Yeah.
And it was this kind of, it was this kind of innocent, like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden kind of a time, right? And a lot of the software developers at the time just kind of took that for granted. And then what started to happen is, over the years, these institutions started to tighten down and they started to create user accounts with different privileges. And then each user would have their own password and they would have limitations in what they could do. And Richard Stallman hated this.
Yeah. When listening to him talk, he uses a strongly moralistic language.
Oh, absolutely.
And I was just watching the documentary last night, OS Revolution, and just kind of jotting down the type of language that he would use. And he constantly was using words like domination and control and like good and bad. And just like to him, software is a very moral world, a very moralistic world. And to most software developers, it's a technical world, and it's a world that consists of problems that need to be solved.
Yeah.
And so whether or not you have a strong ethical slant one way or the other on what should be done with software and how it should be shared, most programmers at the end of the day just want to save time and solve things quickly.
Yeah.
And open source definitely lends itself to that more. And I think that's actually the force behind a lot of open source stuff, is that, someone writes a little program that's useful, and it solves a problem solves a problem maybe better than it's been solved before.
Yeah.
And they don't really want to go through the effort of making a bunch of money off of it and starting a company, because in all likelihood it won't succeed.
Yeah.
And therefore, why not just pay it forward, as many tools have been paid forward to them, and share it with the community. And it's cool because on one level, I'm not saying that, like, even if they could make money, maybe there is this other argument that you share things because it quickens the overall pace of progress.
Yeah.
And technology, which is fun.
Yeah.
Like, everyone wants new shiny things that can do more, right? And ever more so with digital devices.
Yeah.
And so,
right, because digital information is easily replicable, right?
Yeah.
It's practically free to copy software. All you need is just, a thumb drive or a network connection or whatever to actually store the copy, right? But it's effectively can be done effortlessly. Yep.
Now, whether or not you'll be able to utilize that source code is a whole nother question.
Yeah. So I just want to highlight something here which is interesting, is that what you were saying is definitely true, that in the software world, there are so many ways to skin a cat. And there are a lot of things that have, cats that have been fairly well skinned. And it's very effortless to spread that information around. And so it really does save a lot of time and help innovation to share, right? However, this runs counter to the narrative of the way things work in capitalism, right? Which is that proprietary nature and ownership and competition are what spur development. So I want to contrast those two philosophies, right? Because here we have an example of a system which in some ways works much more efficiently and creates development and innovation much, much more rapidly when it is not proprietary, when it is shared freely.
So one of my main questions to the software developers I met with last night was, why should people care? Why should non-software developers care?
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone gave me a really strong answer. And I think here's why. You could take an ideological stance on it, but that's all it's going to be. Because at the end of the day, for the most part, unless you're working for a large corporation, if you're a software developer, most of the tools you use and most of the software that you're using to build your project are free and open source. Mm-hmm. What you get paid for is making something that faces users,
right?
Making a tool that faces users that is unique, and you put those different open source solutions and software pieces together in a way that's useful enough and new enough that people are actually willing to pay for, or that advertisers are willing to be, willing to pay you in order to be exposed to your users on, right?
Right.
And so, and for the most part, applications I don't think are so much open source, right?
Yeah.
It's more like the building blocks that create applications are open source, which is very different.
So like a database, a library, some very fundamental things that the average user wouldn't be able to recognize.
No.
Yeah. So, I think this is a lot of the tension that you see in the modern software industry, is how much is free versus how much is proprietary. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting because I was just going to say, if everything's free, then there's very little economic incentive for large companies to put a lot of money into developing software, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, the capitalistic incentive of a company or a corporation to make money does drive a heck of a lot of development, right? But then free sharing of software also drives a lot of development. So I think that that's part of the interesting tension that we're dealing with, right? Which is what makes it,
because when people get paid to do things, they do more of it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Because if a
but
coda,
when people don't have to pay for things, they use more of it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So if a coder was getting paid $0 to code, how many hours of the week would they be coding? Probably not very many. I mean, some people probably would anyway, right? But,
yeah, a lot of people.
but it's like the people who are coding 40 plus hours a week are usually the people getting paid to do it.
Yeah. There are occasional rare people who will just code all the time. And I think Linus Torvalds is definitely one of those, right? Where he wanted to create things, and that was his passion. Right.
So let's talk about that briefly. Okay, so let's rewind to the mid-'80s. Richard Stallman, who, by the way, if any of this interests you, you should just look up Richard Stallman. He is a character.
Yeah, he is.
He's entertaining. He's very eloquent in a certain kind of a way. Mm-hmm. Like Robin outlined, he uses a very ethically charged language. And he believes down to every last cell in his body is committed to free software.
Right.
So in 1984, he started he started working on this project called GNU, and it was an example of coder humor, the name of this software. So one of the things that coders like to do, they're kind of smart people who like jokes as much as anyone else does. So a lot of free software is named using these self-recursive acronyms. So GNU, GNU, stands for GNU's Not Unix. And so this was a little coder joke. And
because the G in GNU stands for GNU.
Exactly.
Which stands for GNU is not So recursion is kind of hard to explain on the air.
Exactly. But it's like if you think about it too much, you go down in these little fractal chains, right? But anyway, so and his idea was that he wanted to make a version of Unix that was free and open source. So he wanted for anyone to be able to get Unix, install it on their computer, and do whatever they wanted with it. And then in 1985, he was one of the people who started the Free Software Foundation, which is probably like the first acknowledged body that was really devoted specifically to the propagation of free software. Now, they've been responsible for a lot of things that we're not going to go into here, but suffice it to say that there was a very formative organization in the world of free software.
Mm-hmm.
So the GNU system was Stallman's effort to, like I said, recreate Unix. And what he started to do and his team was doing was they were creating a lot of the different building blocks of the Unix operating system from scratch because they weren't allowed to use the code that existed already.
Yeah.
So it took a lot of work. And so work continued on this from 1984 to around 1990. And they'd made a lot of progress, but one thing that they were lacking was the kernel.
Right.
So, Robin, can you explain what a kernel is?
I've been studying for this question, more or less.
Excellent.
So the kernel, a lot of what an operating system does, aside from the kernel first, is it deals with how to allocate instructions from applications to the processor and how to allocate memory to different programs.
Yeah.
And then the kernel mostly deals with, if I understand it correctly, is input-output, and that would include determining what should be sent to your monitor and determining how to handle keyboard and mouse inputs, how to handle network connections, right? If you have Ethernet plugged into your computer, the kernel basically has to be able to take the impulses traveling into your Ethernet hub and then process that into usable data, right? And so that's the kernel, as far as I understand it.
It's like the nervous system of a computer, right?
Isn't it all? Like
maybe.
I don't know. I can't quickly create a metaphor for the kernel.
Right.
Except, I mean, I guess you're right. The nervous system is kind of, the nervous system sends signals to your muscles to do stuff. And that, in the case of a computer, something that it does is it sends signals to the monitor. That's something it does, right?
Yeah.
For the user.
Yeah.
And then it takes signals in from currently our microphones, right? Keyboard, mouse, and the network. And I don't know what else it would take input. If you had a printer, that'd be another input-output device, something like that. So
yeah, and there are a lot of basic drivers. So this word in computers, drivers, is like a specific set of software to make a specific piece of hardware work in your operating system.
Okay.
So there's a lot of these base level drivers are built into a kernel as well.
Okay.
So
that's technically, if I install a printer driver, is that part of my kernel? Or
no, I think like an additional driver that you install. It's like standalone software, but there's a lot of basic, like you were saying, like the driver that your mouse runs on might be in the kernel, right? And there's a lot of like very, very, very basic drivers, which we just kind of take for granted. Yeah. Just things like what makes your hard drive work or stuff like that, which I believe is in the kernel. Now, this all gets very technical, so if you want to learn more about it, I would just research what a software kernel actually is. Yeah. But suffice it to say that the GNU project did not have one. And so in around 1990, this guy named Linus Torvalds, he was like a young guy, I think he was still a student at the time.
He was, yeah.
In Finland, started working on a kernel. And he called it the Linux kernel. And it was kind of like a portmanteau of his name and Unix, right? And managed kind of miraculously to do a large amount of work on this Linux kernel in a very small amount of time. And he really just like bootstrapped this project and submitted it to the GNU project and said, you needed a kernel, here's a kernel. Yeah. Several other people.
He didn't actually send it to them. He just released it.
I guess he just kind of
like put it out on the interwebs.
Right.
And it was kind of the missing piece, though, to the GNU, because the GNU wasn't a full operating system yet, because it needed the kernel. He wrote a kernel that worked for it, and then people were like, "Oh, I guess GNU's basically done if we just include Linux's stuff." And so then you have this operating system. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, to Richard Stallman's eternal dismay, as well as many other people, the operating system ended up being called Linux.
Well, so I looked into this a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit fuzzy.
Okay.
Because I'm not exactly sure, like, whatever distribution of Linux you use, since it is open source, a lot of people would take, like, the original open source version of Linux, and they would modify it and create their own, what's called a distribution or distro.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those distros, I think, rely heavily on the GNU component, and others don't.
They've kind of moved away from it.
Yeah. And so I don't know exactly which ones fall into it and which ones don't, or which ones use GNU and which ones don't. But it is, I guess, a lot of people think it's best practice to refer, if you're using a Unix operating system, quote unquote, then you should call it GNU/Linux.
Right.
Which, you know, Richard Stallman and a bunch of other people worked on GNU for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed like Linux came in and just kind of like took the cake, you know, like what's a better expression? But yeah.
Now, isn't that interesting though? Because again, we're coming into the concepts of ownership.
Yeah.
Right.
So
right. There's a fundamental irony to Richard Stallman getting butthurt about his project getting named after somebody else.
Well, like I said earlier, like there's economic gains, and then there's like the social, there's the identity and getting status, right?
Right.
And people put a lot of blood and sweat into that. So
yeah. So, you know, even the founder of the free software movement, in many ways,
that's a very good point.
He's not free of his ideological attachment to his ideas.
Sure.
So basically, after this happened, this magical Linux kernel and the GNU, it just really created an explosion of free open source operating systems. And the number of operating systems based around the Linux kernel now is like, I mean, it might even be in the millions, but it's certainly hundreds of thousands of different operating systems. And they run on every device imaginable. Mm-hmm. And so your smartphone is running on some version of Linux.
Okay, I always forget, is an iPhone, is it running on a version of Unix or a version of Linux?
That's a good question. I actually don't know.
I don't
know what the basis
some
of
like
iOS
modified
is.
Version of Unix or something. But
yeah.
Anyway, Androids are definitely
Androids
Linux-based.
are Linux-based,
and so I think our Kindles.
Yeah. And there are just all kinds of things, like your smart TV is probably running a version of Linux.
Yep.
There are even much more basic devices, like like a digital toaster or whatever, that might be running a version of Linux.
Yep. Yeah.
And so one of the magic things about Linux, and just about kind of Unix-like, they call them Unix-like operating systems in general, is that it's like the Borg operating system. It can really be tailored to just about anything.
Yeah.
And one of the beauties of it is that it's a very modular system. And so what you can do is you can take the Linux kernel and you can just cut massive swaths out of it and say, we don't need any of this functionality. We're just going to have like a very tailored piece of software.
Yeah.
And it's cool because it's still more efficient than writing it from scratch.
Right.
And it's just it boggles the mind to consider just how high of a percentage of devices in the world these days run some variant of Linux or Unix or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the most impressive stat is that the vast majority of the computers that run the internet run some version.
Like servers.
Yeah, exactly. So the chances are whatever device you're using to listen to this information was delivered the information via a long relay of hundreds or thousands of miles of different Unix-equipped computers.
Yeah.
And your device could very well be some kind of Unix-equipped computer, right? So that is just to convey the scale and the breadth and the utter dominance of this particular operating system. It's like, I mean, it caught on like wildfire. And today, it's still an operating system of choice for many computer applications that are not specifically running a Windows computer or running an Apple computer.
Right.
Actually, the Apple computer now runs a variant of Unix.
Yep. Yeah.
So Windows is actually like one of the only major completely not Unix-like operating systems in the world, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yep. And a testament to just how committed to proprietary software Bill Gates actually was.
Yeah. Now, I want to do a quick musical interlude, but when we come back, I kind of wanted to break into whether or not open source really means what I hope it means, which is a democratization of information technology and all of the tools and powers that come with that.
Stay tuned. And we're back. Hopefully you enjoyed that pleasant musical interlude. And yeah, Robin, I'm curious to hear about your next topic here.
Okay, so one of the big questions I've always had about open source, and one of my big hopes for it, has always been that people who aren't professional programmers would be able to take open source tools and software and be able to cobble things together and make something new and useful to them. And I've always thought that that was sort of possible. And I'm still relatively green as a developer. And so I thought I would just bounce that question off of the developers I ran into last night who are much more seasoned than me. And they were all kind of like, yeah, like, you know, it takes like 10,000 hours to master things. And like, kind of like, it definitely isn't a quick thing to be able to do, right? Like just because, say, someone made their artificial intelligence library open source doesn't mean that anyone can just go start doing artificial intelligence stuff with it.
Right.
Like there's a certain base level of knowledge you have to have about software development to be able to use any of these things.
Sure.
Now, that's definitely a barrier, but I think that people could still take a couple of courses or free courses online and learn enough to be able to start using small things and putting them together. But another piece that's needed, aside from just having if you just put your source code out there on the internet and make it available to people and add a license to it, like the GPL, I think that there needs to actually be a greater level of ambassadorship if there's going to be true access for non-professional developers to be able to use things.
Okay.
Because I do think on some level, if you're using a program that consists of, say, a couple of thousand lines of code in, say, Java or Python or JavaScript, I think most people are capable of actually learning enough of those languages in a few months and reading the source code that they can modify that program to do what they want. But I think that for anything more complex, that's a lot longer, you actually need a little bit of handholding from the developer and a little bit of an explanation of how the thing works and how to do the things you might want to do with it. And that is a lot harder come by. In the software world, I guess it's called documentation, is how well you document what your software is and what it does and what the API is and how to interact with it. And from my own experience, it's most of this open source stuff it's basically you're expected to go in and read the source code. You know, there's no quick how to, there's no quick, if you want to do this, look here. It's, you know, roll up your sleeves and start reading. and start trying to, because there's no even overview about what the different files and folders and what the structure of the project even means. You have to have a certain amount of experience to be able to interpret that. And so I think we're a far cry from that sort of democratization that I think when people said open source back in my college days, that's what I fantasized about was, oh, okay, I can take, vision, open, like AI vision technology that's open source, and I can use it and identify plants if I wanted to, by just modifying somebody else's program. Maybe talk to me in 3 or 4 years and see how that's going. Like,
well, and I think what you're getting at here is the distinction between low level and high level, right? So why don't we talk about that for a moment? Because I think a lot of developers fantasize about one day having tools which are high level enough that people really can just like put together the build, like the average person could open up like a software creator and like drag things around. And specify in a fairly easy and linear way what they wanted it to do and have all of the underlying code just configure itself, right? So why don't you talk to us just a little bit about like low level versus high level?
Well, I think like you described maybe the highest level of development that you could ever have, which is kind of like a GUI, like you drag and drop modules like spatially. And, I've actually done web development, like WordPress, some WordPress, what do they call them? Plugins or themes or something. Where you basically can take components that are visually represented and drag them around on the screen instead of writing HTML and CSS and figuring out the layout that way. And so that's a very high level thing. And low level means you're getting closer and closer to the machine language. Is the way I think of it. And high level means you're getting closer and closer to the way that humans actually think about things, or closer to human spoken language. Which even the highest level coding languages are still coding languages at the end of the day. We don't talk like that.
There aren't coding languages that say like, computer, first I want you to load this up, then I want you to do this.
They're inflexible, right? Yeah. Which it's remarkable. I was thinking about voice commands the other day, and there's various ways that you can tell Google to like remember to like save a date, right? And it's kind of flexible. It's like, there's certain keywords that all will kind of work, but with most programming languages, there's only one.
There's one way to do it.
Single keyword. And if you don't use it right, then the program won't work. So I don't know. That's a quick rundown of it, but I think I'm at the point now where I realize that if anyone does want to utilize open source stuff, and there's like little like maker spaces and like doing maker type projects, it's a small enough scale that you can take source code and do something with it. If you want to just say change the way like a motor rotates, right? Or change the way like a little like kind of crafty small scale project works. It's pretty easy to like take that and read the source code and understand it and modify it. But the bigger and more complex an application, the much more experience is needed. So
sure.
It's just the nature of the complexity of this technology. There's no easy in. So
sure. Yeah, but it does get easier over time, generally. And people have gotten better at making things a bit higher level, making them a bit more modular. So that trend shows every evidence of continuing in that way. So I think it's like each year is like a better year to be a starting coder than the previous one.
I think I generally agree with that. I remember reading a book called Just for Fun, which is by Linus Torvalds and some other like probably ghost writer. But he was saying he was writing a lot of stuff in assembly language, which is much closer to the machine code. And he was saying when he like if he would have written it in C, it probably would have been 100 times faster.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
That goes counter to what I thought you were going to say.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, do you mean the code runs more efficiently?
No. It would have been 100 times more efficient in terms of the time he put into it.
That's what I thought. But he wrote it in assembly language.
Well, C was just kind of burgeoning back when he was learning this stuff too. It's the way he kind of put it.
So he could have chosen C.
He could have, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And perhaps regretted not choosing C.
Well, I guess so.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end here, but before we go, Robin, I just wanted to ask you, because you actually work in software.
I'm an expert.
Okay, so how motivated would you feel to share code that you had worked on in your own free time with the world for free?
Pretty motivated, mostly. I think it depends on what I was making, is maybe the short answer.
Sure.
Because for example, like I'm working on a personal project right now that's mostly just it's an excuse for me to learn new things and to build new stuff. It's a flashcards app. But so it's like there's tons of flashcards apps out there. And, the idea of me working on that, and I've thought about monetizing it, where like, there's certain features that are free. And if you want like nice, convenient features, then you might have to pay like whatever, $1 a month or whatever. And I don't think I'm going to get rich off of that anyway. And so the idea of making it open source doesn't really bother me. And also, you have to think about the benefits of making it open source. The benefits are great, especially for someone like me who's earlier in their development career, because what it does is it exposes your code to a community. And there's basically this community review process at that point where people will look at the code and then suggest changes and try to commit their own changes to it, which is, at the end of the day, it's a critique on the way that you design things in the first place. And so you get to go and look at what other, in the most cases, people who have the resources and ability to do that are going to be smarter, more experienced, more proficient coders than I am anyway. And being able to see their suggestions would be very valuable. And so the idea of someone like me being covetous of their source code for a project like this is kind of ridiculous. Okay, so let me ask you a different question. Let's say that you went into your job as a software developer, and like at the beginning of your work shift, your boss said, "Okay, Robin, so you're going to work 8 hours today. We're going to pay you for 4 of those hours, and they're going to go towards this one project. And then for the second 4 hours of your day, it's going to be your volunteer time towards this other project." How would you feel about that? What other what? Just whatever I want for the volunteer project, or
sure, yeah, it could be whatever you wanted.
But it's some software. Is it open source or?
Yeah, it was open source, and it was gonna be freely available and help.
That sounds like a dream.
Okay, but you'd only be getting paid 50%.
Oh, wait, hold on.
Yeah. So in other words, you'd spend half of your time at that job earning money, and then the other half of your time would be donating your coding time. So after a 40-hour week at this company, you would have spent 20 hours earning money, and the other half of it you would be donating and paying it forward.
This sounds questionable.
How would you feel about that?
That's kind of hard to wrap my head around, but I guess if I could work on anything I wanted for that last 4 hours, that sounds fun. The thing is the pay, like, I don't like the idea of coding for 8 hours a day without getting paid for all of it, frankly, because after 4 to 5 hours of coding, it gets kind of hard. Your mind gets a little bit mushy around 6 hours. Anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, it's a toss up. Like, sometimes it's great and you're still cranking out stuff and you're focused, and other times it's just, you can't hold a thought, right?
Yeah.
After that amount of time. And so maybe if we reduce the shift to 6 hours and said 3 hours is for them and 3 hours is for whatever I want. I don't know. I guess what are you asking me to prioritize or like evaluate?
I guess I'm just curious about the idea that, so Richard Stallman wants all software to be free, right? And it's not that selling software is the only way of making money off of software, but I just think that it's interesting to actually pose the question to a software developer and to just get your sense of like, how much of this work would you be happy to do on your own time with nobody paying?
Oh, I see what you're asking. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if they said, okay, because I think that's a different question. Because being mandated to volunteer at work is the way it sounded at first.
Yeah.
Where I have to volunteer for half of my shift and just do things.
Yeah.
Without getting paid. I would be kind of frustrated with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But occasionally, right now I'm doing a lot of projects that I'm not getting paid for, and I'm writing a lot of code that I'm not getting paid for. And I can do that for a certain amount of time a day, but I don't do it for 8 hours.
Yeah.
I do it for probably anywhere from 3 to 5,
Yeah, so like you as a coder, you do have a general interest in working on projects that might not generate you any money that
definitely.
You would be happy to share the code.
No,
for.
definitely, because it's fun.
Yeah.
It's a craft. You make things. You write code, you run the code, you see if it does the thing you wanted it to do. It's this fun iterative design process.
Right.
That I find rewarding. If you want to, whether it's programming motors and lights and sensors, or programming some kind of web interface, or just design stuff on a web page, I find it fun.
So, and this is the impression I get, is that a majority of people who do work on free software, probably they spend X amount of hours during the week working on software they're getting paid for, and then they spend X amount of hours during the week working on software they're not getting paid for.
Right. And I think that's probably true. Like, I'm trying to remember, what was the example? Oh yeah, Unix. Unix was created that way. So, and the two guys that created Unix, I don't remember their names, but they were working for AT&T and Bell Labs, and officially they were working on this other operating system that they ended up developing a distaste for, and on their own time they created Unix.
Oh, okay. Okay, I didn't know that.
Is my understanding. And I guess I don't know how much I can say on their own time, because it ended up being property of that corporation. But at least they maybe spearheaded that project on their own. And, right. So, yeah, I don't know. It just depends on the developer.
A final thing I wanted to say is that there are plenty of people who work on free software and get paid for it. And that's just because there are a lot of different models for monetization which can allow that to happen. So one of the most popular models is people who will work on free software and they'll sell services for the software. They'll sell support for it. They will sell focused customization. So, for example, let's say there's a company that wants to get into providing cloud services, right? They want to run these kind of large distributed services for lots of users to store data or, whatever. And this company is probably going to pick some kind of software that might be free, right? And there are a lot of software companies out there that will say, yeah, you guys could just take our software and download it and do whatever you want with it. That's great. Run your company that way. However, we've spent X number of tens of thousands of hours developing this, and we know it really well. And it would probably save you money instead of having to have all of your developers work on it and do all this stuff.
Yeah.
We're just going to show you how to do it.
Exactly.
And, we'll make a contract with you and we'll do some customization. We'll write some custom software for you.
Yeah.
We'll tweak it. We'll also support you with any technical difficulties.
Right. So there was a company called Cygnus that did that with the GNU system.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually kind of the magic place to be, is because they're going to have fierce competition, because anyone can do that. Anyone can take the open source software and become distributors of it and also support staff that they're getting paid to do it. Right. And so they have to do a good job at it. Yeah. But it's not always beneficial for any company to just take open source software and assume that they can just get everything done with it that they want to without support. And so the way one of the gentlemen I was talking to last night, and maybe I'll get his name to you later, he has some good points. One of the points he made was, he said, think about your computer and like, what is the most valuable part of that computer? And I was like, for mine, it's the graphics card. And he's like, no. It's the operator's time.
There you go. Yeah.
And his point was that you can take open source stuff and do whatever you want with it, but if you don't have any official support and you don't have anyone to call when shit hits the fan or when things aren't working, then you're probably going to end up wasting a lot of time troubleshooting that.
Yeah.
And so actually finding open source stuff that does have paid support is actually kind of a best of both worlds, in my opinion, especially if you have some software chops and you can do a little bit of troubleshooting on your own. And if you don't have the resources, then you have that paid support.
Yeah. And it's kind of a beautiful thing, because what it allows you to do is that like Joe Schmo can download it for free and have fun with it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe run like a small business or just set up a home server or do whatever it is that they want to do. And that's great. You just help Joe Schmo for free, right? And you can also have a company like Amazon take something and spend billions of dollars on it and make, a number of software companies fairly wealthy in the process. And it does kind of check both boxes, and it's a cool model. Now, there are many other models that people have, which we're not going to get into here. But I just think that it's what this all comes back to for me is what's valuable to a culture, who owns what. And ultimately this is all subjective. We make it all up, right? And that's just really, really interesting to me, is that so much of the productivity of our world is based around these very, very basic distinctions. Who owns a thing? Who gets access to resources? Why do they get access to resources? What do we as a culture collectively agree upon as our values? And who eats and who starves depending on how those values play out, right? And I think that software is just a very interesting case to examine, because I think that it covers some very interesting territory that a lot of other commodities don't necessarily. And as we go into an increasingly digital world, the question which the recording industry has had to ask itself, and the question that many media industries have had to ask themselves, and the software industry, and anything that can happen on the computer has to ask itself, I'm easily replicable. And so how do we deal with that in the face of the fact that a lot of our models are based on scarcity, right? When you can just take something and infinitely replicate it for almost no cost, how do we reconcile that against this supply and demand scarcity model that we're used to? Because up until now, most things in the world have not been unlimited resources.
Right.
So, and I don't have an answer to any of these questions. It's just that this is like the philosophical bedrock of a new era that we're moving into. And I do think that it matters to the average person, not that they're necessarily going to think about it, right? Just like politics or just like climate change or whatever, right? But these things, they do matter, and they do work upon you, and they do affect you. And my hope is that by listening to this episode, it has taken you at least one step deeper into that inquiry.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully, I keep hoping that we'll be able to better utilize open source stuff, that everyday people without having a strong specialty are going to be able to actually utilize this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
well, get on it, buddy. The future waits for no one. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Listening Glass. If you've enjoyed this show, we'd love it if you'd share it with your friends and on social media. Your word of mouth means a lot to us and is a way you can help our humble podcast grow. Find us on our Twitter handle @ListeningGlass. You can leave feedback there or by emailing us at listeningglasscast@gmail.com. Join the ongoing discussion in our community by joining our Discord server, linked in our episode description. This episode features the track Vis in Sitter by Mac Woodruff, the track Dr. Beauchef, Penguin Dentist by Kneebody, and also the track Lipton Service Boy by Eero Johannes. We're incredibly grateful to these artists for letting us feature their work. Find more information about them in the episode description.